I want you to move from overwhelmed by information to confident in what really matters. I want to help you move from being unsure towards direction and purpose in your healthcare. I want to introduce you to health experts. I want to let you in on tough conversations on women's health. I want to give you a place where you can lean in and learn how to take care of yourself. Let's transform your health. Let's get clear on your goals. This is Women's Health Unplugged. I'm your host, Dr. Jordan Robertson, naturopathic doctor. How have you been feeling through the pandemic? This conversation that we're going to have today on the podcast, welcome to Women's Health Unplugged, is with one of my good friends, Carly Crawford. Carly, this is not the first time you and I have had conversations on the podcast about mental health, disordered eating, signs for people to look for in themselves around their mental health and wellness. This year has been like an absolute catastrophe when it comes to the mental health space. And I wanted us to revisit some of the topics we've chatted about in previous years, but also through the lens of what's happened in people's lives over the last year and a half through the pandemic. So first of all, I want to thank you for spending time with me this morning so that we can have this conversation.
You're welcome. I was looking forward to it.
And for those our listeners that don't know you, I mean, first of all, they should go follow you on Instagram because I know you have a love-hate relationship with Instagram, but I love your Instagram. And so I'm grateful that you share in that space. But I would love if you could kind of introduce yourself and walk us through how you got to this space that you're at in your career.
Sure. So my name is Carly Crawford, and I'm a registered psychotherapist. So I used to practice mainly out of Burlington and just recently have moved to Hamilton. So we are located downtown Hamilton. And so starting off in the field, I worked a lot with eating disorders. So primarily with eating disorders, I would say. So that community encompasses quite a vast spectrum of individuals that are coming into therapy. So throughout the years, as I have aged and as I've continued in my practice, this is now my 13th year, we're seeing a lot of different, I'm seeing a lot of different people that are touched by really all different sides of mental health issues, right? So we treat a lot of people that struggle with anxiety, depression, a lot of individuals that are working on kind of repairing their relationship with themselves. So from a self-esteem perspective, trying to figure out balance in their lives. And at the foundation of things, it does often come back to working with individuals with eating disorders, whether it's people that have had eating disorders in their past, working with parents of people that have had eating disorders. I'm completely biased, but I would say that most of the people that are coming through our doors have some sort of history of disordered relationship with food that is impacting their mental health. And so we do find that here, that part of our screening process can be helpful in helping individuals to have a safe space to talk about those things. So we're now here kind of coming out of, well, hopefully anyways, I don't know what it is, 18 months into this pandemic. And we've been able to slowly start integrating some workshops again and to help to kind of meet and educate people on eating disorders and help to allow people to get access to this information a little bit easier. I get the opportunity now to work with 6 other women that are all doing similar-ish things. And the need in the community has been very, very high through the pandemic. Like a lot of other essential services, we were forced to be online for a little bit, which changes the scope of this work. And now we're able to do kind of a bit of a combination of both, which has been really hard for people, right? Adjusting to all of those changes with that consistent person that you're used to speaking to going into their office and now having to get that help from a mental health perspective. I've had moms doing their sessions and sitting in their laundry room hiding from their kids too, in their car. And so it's been a lot for our current clients. And we're hoping that right now we're kind of safely getting people back in to the space if that feels most comfortable for them. So that's a little bit about what we do.
Yeah. And so just for our listeners because I think when we bring up the word or the term like disordered eating, it's very common for, at least in my practice, for my patients to say, oh, no, that's not me. Right? Like, oh, no, you misinterpreted what I said. I don't have. And they think about it within a certain sort of framework of what in their mind actually includes disordered eating. But when I explain to them and then talk about what resources are available, et cetera, we're talking about a much broader definition than the way that most people think about, anorexia or bulimia or binge eating. And I think some patients don't even realize that binge eating would fall in that spectrum of disordered eating. Can you give us kind of a broader look at like, who are we talking about? Like, what does that include from what end of the spectrum to the other?
I think so first of all, and I don't love the very specific diagnostic criteria of eating disorders, and I think that most clinicians that work with this population will agree that it's very limiting, right? So, and it's not necessarily necessary. It doesn't help us in terms of our prognosis and or our treatment plan if someone is fitting exactly into the very specific criteria to meet, say, an anorexia nervosa diagnosis or bulimia or binge eating. So what we look at is trying to help people from a psychoeducational standpoint understand kind of how food fits into their life in a positive way, in a negative way. How does it make you feel? What sorts of emotion does it bring up? How does it fit in your life in terms of your behaviors, right? So do you have a hard time listening to your body and using food as punishment or reward? Or, a lot of people will say that eating disorders are a coping mechanism to deal with the other stuff. And I think that that's not a bad way of explaining it. I think the challenge with that comes with people feeling like that coping needs to be very extreme. So it needs to be like, oh, I've gone through the drive-through and ordered 45 donuts. So that's me coping. That must mean that there's a problem, versus maybe looking at, I have no interest in cooking ever. I have a very hard time getting my meals on the table. That's also another form of this is impacting your emotional health in a negative way. So I think that it's very, very hard. And this came up recently. I was able to sit with other clinicians. We did a training here, and this took up a lot of conversation, actually, just kind of this whole idea that where do you find someone who doesn't have disordered eating, right? So we are food places so much moral and valued for people that I think they get I could see that when you say that people get, oh, no, I don't, almost defensive. There's a lot of shame involved in even talking about food. And so I think that if we as a society, it was a bit easier for us to share a bit more about kind of not a perfect way of eating, just this is what my lunch looked like today. And it was more quote unquote normal. I think it would help people to see just how disordered eating they are, right? So disordered eating examples could be like only eating very limited foods, having a very hard time being social with other people, which in the pandemic, we didn't have to do that, right? So that's usually a big red flag for people. That's like, yeah, I have a hard time going out to eat with friends, or I have a hard time with overeating after I do that. I go to 4 more places afterwards because I've started that cycle that my brain can't stop thinking about the food. So, and I think in the world of naturopathy, and when you are seeking care for whatever the range of health experiences that bring you to go and see a doctor, sometimes that can be a bit confusing for people because they do have to eliminate certain things, or they do have to add certain things. And so I think that whole disordered eating piece can become even more confusing, right? Because it's like, okay, well, I actually can't eat those things because those things cause me a lot of pain, or, whatever. So working with the individual to try to figure out what their normal is with food, right? And that means that we have to figure out what the function behind the behaviors that are not normal right? Like, where is that coming from?
Yeah, it totally makes sense. And I think, and we don't like in medicine, and I mean, I think just humans in general, we don't love that when that gets really gray, right? That like even to say a behavior that maybe was functional at one point in time in your life has now become maladaptive and dysfunctional, even though it's the same behavior. Like we have a hard time with that in just in general as humans, that like there's going to have to be this ebb and flow in your understanding of those things. So if we teach a patient to eat, broccoli and rice and chicken because we're doing it to help lower their blood pressure, does that in 5 years turn into now this is actually a maladaptive behavior because I have fear of what happens if I have a hamburger, right? And
Yes,
so
you were mentioning that. Yes, absolutely.
so it's tough because I think, and then in the online space, even like listening to and learning about nutrition is so difficult because there are some positive, healthy things that we want people to move towards or have incorporated as part of their healthy behavior and patterns of nutrition. But each and every one of those things that we talk about also could cause harm in another individual.
And that's why it's so complicated. Right. And then that's why I think that this conversation is so multifaceted, right? Because you're absolutely right. And I'm glad you brought that up. And we talk a lot about thought patterns and cognitive behavioral therapy, which is one of the elements that we may use with some of our clients here. And that black or white, that we will have people that 25 years ago had someone say to them, you shouldn't ever have lentils, and like it's stuck in their head that okay, well, absolutely can't have that, when really it's more about trying to help individuals recognize that food for the most part, and I recognize that this isn't, not everybody can do this because of various things, but can be flexible and can change, and you don't have to have things be so rigid all of the time, which again, if we think about kind of the question of what has happened in this last little while, I think that most of us can relate to things felt very out of control, very catastrophic, as you said. And unfortunately, like doing things to our body and how we feed ourselves, how we look, how we, present can be an easier thing to control, right? For some people, that's kind of what is a more comfortable line for them, which with food, it's can snowball into a lot of really challenging moments.
And so like what have you noticed over the last 18 months? And I'm going to like let's go big picture, like just mental health in general, but then I want to bring it down to talking a little bit about what that's done to people's relationship with their bodies and food. But if we think about just like big picture, what have you noticed over the last 18 months? I know I've experienced it in these like stages with my patients, like there was stage 1 and stage, but what have you noticed?
I think so there's two parts, right? So what we've noticed here is that our current clients, it's been very difficult for us to take new clients in. So I know that we've got just the influx of people that are trying to get care has been more than we ever have, right? So that right there tells you something, right? That tells you that people are not, it's a wonderful thing that people are reaching out. And that means that usually from a psychotherapy standpoint, you're not reaching out until things are really, really hard, right? So that means that people have been holding on to things for quite a while. I think with our current clients, so individuals that we had known kind of before the pandemic and have worked through, I kind of liken it to a bit of an iceberg, right? Like it's like we've only been able to talk about the day-to-day stuff. It's getting a little bit better. I would say I don't know. Time is so hard. Probably the last 6 or 7 months, we've been able to get back into, okay, what were we talking about when you first came here, right? Like and so I think that people have lost a lot of their kind of momentum in therapy through the last little while because we've been having to talk about things that we've never had to talk about, right? And so we've had to make space for a lot of the stress, like increased anxiety from people, right? Increased kind of interpersonal challenges with people being in the home with people way more than they ever were, right? So lots of relationship stuff, lots of I need to now have a couples therapist, or I need to get my kids in here, or like that sort of thing. I definitely think, unfortunately, for some individuals that have come to us, say, with an eating disorder or a history of substance use or anything like that, like those patterns have increased, and we've had to work on obviously kind of recognizing that, yeah, that's kind of a normal reaction to stress, and what are we going to do about it. I think it is important to the rates of eating disorders, specifically like diagnosed eating disorders, has gone up really, really high. To be honest, as someone who's worked in this field and seen how long the wait lists have been forever, and just the demand for care, like the demand for care for us has not necessarily increased for eating disorder referrals. But a lot of the programs that are available in the hospitals have had to shut down and be very limited. So we are seeing people that are they're quite into their illnesses, right? Which means that it's even doing psychotherapy on an outpatient basis is not always super effective, right? So that's kind of what we're seeing. We're seeing that, like, even us as therapists are trying to keep our heads above water, right? So being very, very mindful as we grow as a practice, and as we're seeing people that are maybe going through harder things than they normally would be, that we've had to really take note of our capacity as well. So I think that's an important thing to kind of mention, because I know that it's affected some people in the community, that therapists have had to take time off, or therapists have had to, take a longer summer break. And like, these things are really hard when you're going through therapy. And it's like, we're all human going through something somewhat similar, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, it's so interesting. Like, even when I reflect back on like my own personal experience through the pandemic, like I didn't see my therapist for like almost a year, right? January 2020 was my last like in-person appointment. And then I had a virtual appointment, which I hate. Because I'm like
Don't
this
love
was
it
like
either.
cry fest over the phone, right?
Yeah.
Like, which I did not enjoy. And then finally just had my first in-person appointment like last month, which was also like just like 45-minute cry fest of just being caught up on my life in the last year and a bit. But it's like that, like I've gone to therapy like every single month for 10 years. Right. And even like as a well person, that was still something that was like incredibly important part of my like health infrastructure. And it was just not accessible. And I would like, as a healthcare worker, to not be able to access mental health support during the pandemic, I felt like that was a whole other conversation that probably needed to happen
Yeah.
somewhere.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
You're bringing up some memories too, Jordan. Like, I think that the other part was, okay, like there's clearly lots of aspects of this pandemic that I still need to process, but even just like navigating how emotional it was to sit across from my clients that, we deal with a lot of trauma. We deal with a lot of pretty complex individuals, because everybody is, and having them wear a mask,
Mm-hmm.
and having them leave and feel so emotional because they couldn't see my face, right? And like, all of these things that in the last little while that we have been able to safely, with COVID testing and rapid testing and vaccinations and being in a big office, like take our masks off, and just how emotional it is for my clients that see my face for the first time in a year, that I didn't even, like, all of these things that just become commonplace, that I'm just like, yeah, that's terrible. Like, your safe place has now changed, right? So I think that is something that we had to work through a lot with individuals as well, was just kind of recognizing that this might be a little bit of a setback, and that we're hoping to be able to kind of move that forward, right?
Mm-hmm. I know I had never had as much appreciation for my patients who cried with a mask on until I went to my own therapy appointment. And then I was like, literally, like, I felt like I had snot like all up in my cheeks, and like I could like licked my lips and it tasted like snot. And like I was like, oh my God, this is like literally the worst. And I was like, the hundreds and hundreds of people that I've had cry in my office over the last year with a mask on, like my empathy like skyrocketed for their experience because it literally is horrible.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. So it's been a lot. It has been a lot. Yeah.
yeah. And I would say, like, so thinking about where we're at right now. So, I always talked about the beginning of the pandemic, like, say, like, people didn't know if it was Thursday or 3 a.m. Like, it was just like chaos at the beginning. And I think people who felt, that they had made a lot of progress and a lot of goals and was moving forward in their health felt really like that carpet got ripped out from underneath them, right? It was interesting for me to watch like what happened when someone's 5K race got canceled, they stopped running, right? Even though like they didn't have to, right? And yet like there was just that, like, the watching the psychology of what happens when everything came to a grinding halt and how that influenced people's pattern of behavior. And even the people that were, I'm going to say in air quotes, like stable, doing relatively well pre-pandemic, lost the momentum, drive, and the mental wellness to actually maintain some of the habits that were so beautifully ingrained before the pandemic. Um, and actually, my experience over the last couple months has been that we are like in a different place, but not much further ahead than we were then from a mental health perspective. And my perspective has been that there's been this like drive and pushback to normal, again, in air quotes, when we're dealing with like a really depleted and kind of unwell group of people, trying to have them go back to like in-office work and get their kids back in extracurricular activities. Like, can you comment a little bit on that, like push to normal and what you're noticing?
Yeah. I think people are confused as to why am I tired? Why am I feeling so much more fatigue? Why am I feeling um the words that people will use are words like unmotivated. Why am I feeling unmotivated? Why am I feeling like I'm being antisocial? Why am I feeling like I am not productive, right? Which all of those, if we spin them in a different way, means you're feeling low, right? People get very scared to hear the word depressed, and that's fine. It shouldn't be a scary word, but it's kind of that low level of depression that's like, yeah, you're having a lack of interest in things that you used to do because you're burnt out, right? So people are sick of hearing from me, anyways. I know my individuals that I work with are like, I can't possibly still be burnt out. I'm like, but you are, because we haven't done the
No
thing that you need
repair.
to do to allow yourself to not be burnt out, right? So we keep adding things onto this shoddy foundation. And so we're definitely hearing that. I think that people are also kind of noticing that, like, the people around them are now not as maybe strong as they need them to be. And so it's like I'm noticing that people are finding it harder to kind of access those other things that could maybe have helped with their mood in the past. Like, other people don't necessarily want to get together, or other people haven't had that phone call from my girlfriend on the way to work in 6 months, because that girlfriend also doesn't have the capacity to have that conversation, or whatever the case may be, right? One thing that I am noticing a bit is, and we haven't necessarily talked about this together, but kids, right? So I'm noticing that kiddos have also been kind of thrust into the normalcy again. And we're so excited about it as parents. And I think that they are excited about it to a certain extent. But if we don't have the ability to really process what has happened in the last little while and keep up with everything changing, they 100% don't, right? And so, really being aware, I noticed a lot of, you know, even including myself, as a mother of two school age kids and other kind of people in my demographic, it's like, well, why aren't they getting ready for school fast enough? And this is so stressful. And this is like all of that regular kind of stress that is on us as moms is harder, because your kids are feeling a lot of things as well, right? And it's so much harder for them. It can be so much harder for them to articulate that, right? And so it comes out in other ways that, so we're getting a lot of calls around like behavioral issues or eating disorders are very high in the very young population right now. Um, so those types of things have been really hard to kind of try and manage and support, right?
Yeah, you've hit on a lot there. Like, and I know even just my personal experience, my daughter hasn't slept through the night in like 6 weeks just because she's anxious, right? Like she can't identify what it is or what it's about, or so we subsequently have not slept in through the night in the last 6 weeks either. But if for like a generally pretty happy kid, like her mood is not as good as I feel like I want it to be, right? Because, or the way that it maybe used to be. But you know, there's like those micro pressures of living, you know, her day in a way that is different than what is ideal for her, whether that's masking or sitting apart from her friends or being cohorted with different friends or whatnot. And she can't really articulate exactly what it is. She just knows something sucks.
Something feels like a lot in her body, right? And
Yeah. Yeah.
that's usually the conversations that we like to have with, you know, school age kids around like, okay, you don't necessarily have to say what, like it drives my daughter crazy. And I'm like, well, what's going on? What's wrong? She's like, well, nothing. But we as parents know that like there's something there. And I think it's just, yeah, it's been a friggin' hard time for them too, right? And
Yeah.
we've just I'm speaking for myself, kind of just expected them to, you know, as a family that we kept our kids home. And so there was, okay, you're home. Okay, now we're going back. Okay, now it's closed. It's like, and I'm noticing that, I don't know, there's a lot, there can be a lot more fear in the little ones too, right? With the virus and being mindful of how we're talking about it. And I know that, so Karthika and VD here work with kind of that 14, 13, 11 to 18-year-old group. That is, you know, something that I haven't done. And that's what they're noticing. It's a lot of just fear being put somewhere.
So just kind of circle back on like this, you know, recognizing some signs in yourself around, I want to go back to the food thing for a sec, because I think, I mean, that's your jam and your expertise. I think like one of the challenges in that lack of access to care. I mean, in healthcare, we kind of sucked at screening for disordered eating before. And I'm gonna make a slight assumption that having 2-minute phone calls with your healthcare practitioners over the last 18 months hasn't actually enhanced our ability to screen for this. Like how do people actually navigate their healthcare appointments in the context of like maybe starting to recognize those signs in themselves that they might actually be struggling with their relationship with food? Because so much healthcare talks about food.
I think that we do the same thing though, Jordan. Like I think that it happens in therapy as well, right? Where we, if somebody emails and says, I have an eating disorder, we have a questionnaire that we get them to fill out. But I think it's very easy to miss, right? And so I think that making safer spaces, I guess, or trying to help individuals with through things like this and getting more awareness of that this is a normal part of what should be in kind of an everyday check-in around like how are you feeling about food, how is your mood, like trying to put those pieces together to help the individual put the pieces together that okay, like I'm coming to you with maybe I've been feeling more irritable or more stressed, or like I would imagine these are some of the things that you would see. And I've also noticed that, oh, I can't stop eating sugar or whatever the case may be, which I'm just picturing what I know some might have.
Yeah, you nailed it. That's
So
everything.
trying to say, okay, like we need to demystify a lot of what people don't understand about eating disorders and understand about, I hate that they're called eating disorders, and I've said that a million times, just understanding the role that these behaviors play and how it kind of filters into everything, right? So trying to help, and I think that, well, I know that your clinic does a really good job of screening and asking really great questions and helping to like, we've kind of realized that in our intake calls, some things are a little bit harder for people to talk about, but if we can give them some paperwork to just take on their own and reflect on and submit to us, it makes it a little bit easier to kind of answer those questions. So I guess I think what we all need to do as any kind of healthcare workers is just making sure that people are understanding why we're asking those questions. So I'm going to ask you some questions about food just to get a better picture on kind of your day-to-day self-care and kind of how you're feeling about food, because food can be a complex topic versus tell me what you're eating in a day, because that makes me feel like I'm going to be judged and I'm probably not going to tell you the truth, or I'm going to avoid the topic altogether. Because I think that there are, I don't know, I would imagine that would be very important in lots of circumstances, that you know what the person that you're treating is eating. But again, our society and diet culture really places a lot of worth on that, right? So you're either a really good person if you're eating your 150 grams of protein a day or however much, like, or you're failing and you're not, and that means that you're lazy and all of these terrible things that our minds will tell us when we're not in a good place, right?
I even think too, like when I think about that, like, the coming together of the person or the patient or the client and the healthcare professional, like there's really kind of this, like, I'm going to call it responsibility, I suppose, of both of those people coming to that conversation with enough lean in order to actually access that part of someone's healthcare. Because I will also say, like, as a healthcare professional, like, it's very common that I'll ask patients, I'm like, tell me about your mood. And they're like, what do you mean? I'm like, like, tell me, like, what's your experience of your mood over the course of a day? Do you notice differences over the course of a week? Like, what's your experience over the course of a month? And they're like, I don't know what you mean. It's fine. And and yet, right, like when we get down to some of their like chief concerns, which happen to be not well rested when they wake up in the morning, fatigue, inability to perform in their day or their exercise, right, like PMS, and yet they have like almost like separated that from their experience of their mental health. um, that we're not like particularly good at reflecting on the impact that our mood is having on our general state of well-being. You made a perfect example there of like, you actually need to feel relatively well in your mental health to make yourself dinner. And we often will just say to patients, like, okay, take your lunch, right? Like, take your lunch to work, stop going to the food court, without realizing, like, do you know how much Tupperware and how much bandwidth and how much grocery shopping and how much planning it takes for someone to pull off taking a lunch to work? Their mental health cannot be poor. Otherwise, that is not, like, literally not on the table, not an option for them. But we'll talk about so many of these like daily practices, just like in passing, like the things that like every competent adult should be able to do these things. And we separate it from that mental health and wellness conversation. And when people can't do it, then they feel shame rather than being able to reflect and say, actually, it's my mood that's in the way.
And I think that that's part of the things that's really hard for people to, again, it's the self-compassion piece. It makes no sense. And I say this all the time, and my clients know this about me because I personally hate cooking. So, talking to them about like that is actually, I don't know what you're comparing yourself to, but if you're comparing yourself to, your colleague that gets up and does their meal prep for the whole week or whatever the case may be, that's wonderful for them. But that requires a lot of time and energy and this and that and the other, right? And this is where the whole kind of it gets into that cyclical pattern, because it's about, so is this eating disorders, or is this more just that eating is part of everyday life and it is impacted by our mood, right? So whether it's like, okay, yeah, no, I didn't feel like making a smoothie this morning, so I did go to the McDonald's drive-through and now I feel like that I'm the worst person in the world, versus no, that makes a lot of sense. You were hungry, you got food, have some vegetables later on in the day, right? Like that whole all or nothing kind of piece of things is super tough, right?
And so when people are navigating, so let's just say for argument's sake that people realize that they're having this like sort of call it like a maladaptive relationship with their food and their nutrition. And yet then they go for their like yearly physical and their cholesterol levels are elevated and they get spouted off these recommendations around nutrition. Like, how can people approach their healthcare appointments in a way that creates that awareness and sensitivity? And I know it's not the patient's responsibility. So I'll start with that. It's not the patient's responsibility. However, I still want this to feel like an empowered conversation rather than like, well, I'm sorry that your healthcare practitioner doesn't know what to ask. But how can we feel a bit more empowered in those situations and communicate that to the people that are trying to support us?
I think that a lot of it is more about trying to help again, like what we've talked about already, is to understand what else is going on in everybody's lives, right? To be able to make some meaningful goals or some accessible goals, and really reinforcing that idea that, okay, so we've recognized that your cholesterol is up, or unfortunately your insulin is and I'm probably saying this wrong, these are just things that I've learned through my clients, right? That so you actually do have to take some action. This is really important because it's dangerous, right? So, or on the flip side, some of my clients that, their sodium is really low, their potassium is really, like, all of these things that you have to make these food changes in order for your body to function in a way that is going to relieve some of this anxiety that you're feeling, that is actually going to help your mood feel better. Like, we can't ignore that connection, right? So it's about making, okay, so if you can't do that perfectly, let's just focus on these smaller steps that you can take at a time, right? So can we try really hard in the morning to, instead of just having your coffee, we work on, like, having some hard boiled eggs is relatively inexpensive. So let's try to do that. Or like trying to kind of, I think people think it needs to be this really complex thing that is going to cost a whole lot of money. And I think sometimes it does. And I'm sure that there are some kind of interim steps. I think that in terms of how you have that conversation with your healthcare, I think that it's more about having, perhaps, when you're being able to have that confidence to say that I know that this is part of my story, is that I have to talk about food and I have to kind of figure this out, which is super hard for most people. Can't do that. But not feeling like you can't do that, not feeling like you can't kind of say, okay, actually what you're asking me to do is kind of triggering for me, and it's making me think that I shouldn't eat anything because I have a history of this, right? So trying to open up the conversation so that it's not so shame induced as well, right? Because I guess maybe that comment goes more towards people that are very aware that they have, a history of a traumatic relationship with food. And it might be harder for them to bring that up.
I always find it so fascinating that like the research on nutrition is like the recommendations that get made and the research on nutrition are, you know, such small interventions. It'll be like, we took people who eat fast food every single meal and we gave them some almonds and their cholesterol went down. And that's the intervention and it worked. Right. And then yet somehow we've taken everything we've ever written about nutrition and put it all into one diet and made people feel like if they don't do every one of these 10,000 steps and the greens powder in the smoothie and the lemon water before the coffee and the thing, and when like literally the research is like, yeah, we gave these guys some almonds and look what happened, right? And
That's so funny that you said that. Yes.
and so
No, it's so, yeah. That's what I say all the time, Jordan. Like, I think I was at Thanksgiving on the weekend, and somebody brought a sugar-free cake, sugar-free something or other, pie or something, doesn't matter. And everyone was like, oh, why is that, blah, blah. And then somebody was like, you need to have that. The doctor said you need to watch what you eat. I come from a family of like Olympians, so I had to pipe up. I was like, the doctor said that, making the assumption that you eat like very poorly, like you do not. So let's try to have some. It's okay to have that now, because the rest of the time you're not having, no nutrition the rest of the day, kind of thing, right? But it's very hard. Again, it's easier for our brains to have that black or white. No, you said this, so this is what I have to do. But that leaves, and then again, we're back to, but then that leaves so much hardship with people feeling like they're not good enough, people feeling like they're not doing the right thing, people feeling like everything's their fault. Like, and then the self-esteem and everything gets hard, right?
Yeah, when the reality is we probably need to make like one small change at a time that has been proven, let me say that word again, proven to show like an actual health benefit for their specific concerns, right? So we do know that there are patterns of eating that help support cholesterol or mental health or what have you, but it's actually not this like monumental life overhaul that actually, that accomplishes those goals. I think when I imagine people going to those health appointments and, that one piece that can be sort of helpful, again, it's not the patient's responsibility to get this kind of care, but even to be able to recognize when you're being given like 5 or 6 or 10 steps to say, like, that's a lot of steps that you are asking for me. Can you help me understand what the most important thing is? Right. And technically, like as a healthcare professional, you should be able to go, like, oh, yeah, you know what? The olive oil, that is like, do that every day. The rest of the stuff we'll work on. Like that's really what their plan should kind of look like. And if it's not feeling like it's coming across that way, sometimes those clarifying points as the patient can be helpful to help you get a grip on like what the actual important piece is. And then you can contextualize that with the rest of your food challenges or make those steps like as is, possible for you or accessible for you. But a great health plan should look like this is the most important thing that you have olive oil.
Yes.
Do you see any obstacles to doing that? Right?
And yeah, and it's the same what we do here, right? It's like, yeah, okay, so you're asking me what you need to do to treat your depression, your what, you know, there's probably 17 things that that person needs to do, to be quite honest, but that's not going to happen. So like, let's be realistic on like starting here, right? And celebrating those wins as that person is able to achieve that, right? So that's I think it's interesting to hear you say our clients shouldn't have to. I don't think you use the word advocate, but we have to kind of coach our clients very differently to say, yeah, you're gonna have to. It's mostly kind of the general GP, like how the OHIP funded healthcare, but you're going to have to walk them through this. You're going to have to ask for all of these things. You're going to have to and that's okay, right? Which is a lot of pressure for people, right? But I think we have to normalize that a little bit too, is giving people that empowering individuals to be kind of just as involved in their mental health, their physical health, spiritual, everything, right? To be able to ask.
No, you're absolutely right. I think when I was saying, it's not your responsibility, more is that I'm saying it's not your fault that it hasn't happened up until this point, right? That I don't want people to feel like, well, I've never been able to articulate to my doctor that I'm struggling with my relationship with food. It's not your fault that you haven't been able to advocate for that in the past, because we've held those positions in this as like a higher power, right? And I think that's where the part of that damage can be done, is like we hold that person in high regard as a higher power, and then when we come to them with our concerns and our concerns are not met, that actually does not do positive things for people's mental health, right? And I don't want people to feel like they bore the responsibility of getting their disordered eating treated by their general practitioner if they didn't advocate for themselves. But what I deeply want for them is to be able to advocate for themselves.
I also think, though, like that's coming from you and I that are probably
highly sensitive.
Well, and we're also aware we're going to do those things. We're going to ask our patients, our clients, however you define them, those questions, right? So I think that that's where the challenge is when it comes to potentially other individuals that are maybe not as aware of how interrelated things are and are focusing very much kind of their practice in a bit of a silo, that it's harder for them to kind of encourage their clients or be open to those conversations. And those are the people that I would say, like, okay, so you're going to this person, you're going to have to really educate them on the fact that you've suffered from depression your whole life, or you've had an eating disorder. So no, you're not going to get on a scale when you go to that doctor. And yes, they're probably going to look at you funny, but you have to tell them that there's no reason for them to weigh you, so you're not going to do that kind of a thing, right? These are harder and certain environments, right? I don't think that either of our environments are creating that for them.
And how much of a sign it is? So like thinking about our audience who's listening, who's like, oh yeah, like I follow this person. I almost bought this person's program. I kind of want to do this 30-day, I don't know what, whole challenge to get back on track. Like that like continuous like searching for that next greatest thing that's going to help support in your health. Like how much of that is a signal that maybe we're maybe looking at like a dysfunctional relationship with food? Like even just seeking out those professionals, I think might be a slight red flag.
I think that I think it's a red flag that that person. I talk about the feeling connected and disconnected, right? And so eating disorders and everything in that spectrum is a really good way of feeling disconnected. And so that's where like we're avoiding things, we're not able to feel grounded. It's all of those things. And I think that when we're searching for these things, so I will have people so individuals that I treat that don't like their primary concern isn't that they have an eating disorder, but they know I'm loud about these issues. So they'll come in and they'll be like, I know you're gonna be mad or you're not gonna approve, but I did this cleanse.
I did a juice cleanse.
Yeah. And it felt amazing. And I know that you don't agree with it and blah, blah, blah. And so I will just try to help them to see that you feel amazing right now because you did something for yourself. And I'm sure I've never done a juice cleanse. I don't know. I don't know, whatever. It probably feels fantastic to feel the high that comes when you're starving yourself, right? That's what we see in anorexia all of the time. And what I think is bigger is that when you're feeling so low and so, that you're doing everything wrong or that you failed or that, you don't like the way that you look, or you go to this thing that it's going to make you feel amazing because they're promising you all of these things and you're checking the boxes and it's giving you that positive reinforcement. So the conversations we have in this office is more about the psychological element, which is that, yeah, I get it. It makes you feel amazing at the time. And then what is going to happen, right? Like what is going to happen when you eventually have to start eating again? Right? Or what is going to happen when you can't afford to continue to do this program? Like trying to help the individuals to see that, okay, this is you seeking that change, right? So whether that's an exercise plan or a food plan, it's probably to do with, something else that's going on in terms of your mood and your emotional stability. But that brings us back to that question that when you ask your patients, like, how is your mood? People don't know. People don't know even when they come in here. Like, I don't know. I feel the same way I always do. It's easy to identify anger and it's easy to identify sadness, but only when you're really teary. But everything else in between is hard. And so trying to kind of draw those connections for people is not always super easy. Right? But we do a lot of psychoeducation around like the dieting cycle and what has happened. And most of the people we see know that. They know that they've signed up for, a name of a company. And yes, they did feel better and they achieved their goal. And then they felt like they failed after because oftentimes those things aren't sustainable, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So thinking forward and I don't want to say like coming out of this because I feel like I've been saying that for like 18 months. But sort of trying to think like positively and moving forward. I think there's a lot of pressure right now on parents. I think there's pressure for that like return to normal, whatever that feels like. I think people have adopted a lot of self-medicating habits and behaviors over the last, or numbing habits and behaviors over the last 18 months to try and help manage their mood for better or for worse. How do we move through all of that? I know that that's a really big question and maybe we don't really have the answer for it, but how do we start to think about like some positive change moving forward that is sustainable, actually, that isn't a 5-day juice cleanse?
think it comes back, and this is something that we're just coming off of Mental Health Awareness Week, which is really just an excuse for me to yell about mental health and the importance of it, right? I think it comes back to trying to figure out a way for all of us to make this a priority, right? So that doesn't mean that you make, having to go and make an appointment with Dr. Jordan and her team, or Carly or whatever. That means that trying to carve out something in your day multiple times a week that you're doing that is connecting to yourself and connecting to paying attention to the sheer importance of where you're at from a mental health perspective and an emotional health perspective. I think that and I know that you can relate to this, Jordan, and or for sure see this in your patients, but it's the go, go, go busyness of this world that we live in that I think I remember reflecting and writing, like, this pause is necessary, right? Like, do I feel horrible for all of the negative things that come from people having to like stop working and everything else? Absolutely. The whole time I was saying, like, something needs to change. Like, we are not living our lives as individuals. That is like, we're going to break down, right? And so really trying to use this as an opportunity. And I say this to my clients all of the time, like, start a new month or a new day or a new week to say, where am I at? What do I need to keep in my life? What do I need to leave behind, right? Did I go back into normal really quickly because I got really excited and kids started getting invited to birthday parties and all of a sudden my boss wants me back? And like, where can I push back, right? To say, no, I need this night free to myself, right? Or I do need to, and I can afford to not cancel my appointments and make that therapy appointment or sign up for art lessons or just something that, again, I'm just repeating that idea between like being disconnected being too busy, like not grounded, not focusing, and being connected to something that is important to you and that is taking care of yourself. Right. And so I think that that's the thing that people need to really, I would encourage anyways, to take inventory on now. Like, what's the date? Oh, it's the 12th, right, of October already. So, and then like we're getting into the Christmas craziness, which is lovely that, we can experience that. But I also think the flip side of this is that there was a lot of light and benefit that came out of things being a lot slower.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And no one's going to argue with me and win if they say that the busyness is helpful.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? And that comes from someone who I actually do need to be busy. That does help my depression, but not busy to to a point where like I'm literally avoiding everything in my life. And when I have 5 minutes to sit down, I break down. That's too much, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love the Brene Brown talking about like operationalizing your values, because I think if we asked people like, how important is your mental health? They'd say, oh yeah, it's super important. And we say, well, show me where in your practice it is that value, right? Like, where in your week, if your value is your health, if your value is your mental health, where is it, right? Like, how are you operationalizing this value? Because saying it and then not doing the gratitude practice, or saying it and skipping your yoga class, or saying it and canceling your therapy appointment, saying it and then saying yes to that other birthday party that now means you have 3 birthday parties. Like, that is not, you're not executing on the value. Right. And it's hard. Like, it's easy to say that something is your value. And then it's hard to say no to your book club because now you've got too much shit in the week. Yeah. But that discomfort is actually where we start to see progress in, 100%. Right? Because the way that you start to develop traction in your mental health is actually those micro moments of discomfort, rather than always numbing or always treating your mental health with whatever the next greatest thing is, whether that's a chocolate chip cookie or binge watching a show or some kind of substance. Yeah. It's like the micro discomfort of saying no to those things and yes to the thing that you say you value.
Absolutely.
right?
But that's where I think it's hard, because what a lot of the individuals that I work with, so I do a type of therapy called ACT therapy, which is all values based. I love it. And so what my clients, and it's been happening a lot lately, which I'm actually super excited about. It's hard for them, but it's like, okay, I've started to set these boundaries. I've said no to these, like other people don't understand, right? Other people may not be as forgiving that you were like, yeah, no, not doing Thanksgiving, not going to put myself in that fire or whatever the case may be, right? Like, so, but I think that this collectively, it's about really helping that person that eventually they start to be like, oh Jesus, like it actually felt really good that I had 3 nights that I didn't have 4 things that I had to run to after work, or I, boundaries in relationships, like all of those really important things that people aren't really thinking of when your question of like, so how is your mental health? What are you doing for your mental health? Which looks different for everybody, right? For some people that looks like having to take medication. For some people that looks like taking a day off work and having to have a little bit less pay, but that helps them to be able to kind of move on and handle everything, right?
Mm-hmm. And I will say, as I was reflecting on what I just said there, like that discomfort that we feel in like valuing our mental health becomes more unbearable the more burned out we are,
Yes.
right? And so that feeling of that lack of motivation, like I don't know what's wrong with me, I don't have any willpower, I can't get my leggings on to go to the basement to do my workout. It's that the discomfort of saying yes to the workout is actually unbearable when you're burned out and depressed. And that's why we end up in such a difficult cycle. And that's why that plan has to be so strategic, because maybe it's just putting your running shoes on and going around the block and not doing the yoga class. Like maybe that actually is less discomfort. When people live in that like black and white mentality, they imagine like if they're not doing the thing that was prescribed, then they failed.
And people have a hard time with change and involvement, right? So it's also a lot of conversations that we've had over the last, I don't know, year or whatever, is that what worked for you before maybe isn't working for you anymore. And that's okay. So you used to really enjoy um, going to the gym. That doesn't feel good anymore. So we need to find something else, right? Or that therapist used to really help you. It's not feeling like that anymore. So we need to look at something else. Like there's lots of things that you need to sleep more, you need to sleep less, you need to like it's sometimes, again, we've talked about this like 4 or 5 times already today. People get so locked in that they're not understanding that our needs have changed. Like our needs as human beings have changed because the world around us is changing. So it doesn't make any sense that we would just keep doing the same thing over again.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that my therapist said in my last session, which was my first session, like since the beginning of the pandemic, he was like, when was the last time that you successfully did that? Right? Like we were talking about something that I wanted to like get back to. I want to get back to this. And he was like, when was the last time you did that? And I was like, 2 years ago. Shut up. Right? Like, because it was such a like, it was so like in my face, like, oh yeah, Jordan, like you don't just like get back to this thing that you're talking about. There's steps and progress, and you probably have to work back up to that thing that you're talking about. But it was such a like interesting reminder that like in a way we almost kind of want to imagine that the last 2 years didn't happen. And so our expectations of ourselves are very similar to the expectations we had 2 years ago, where if 2 years of regular life had gone by, we would have adapted our expectations. We would have tried different things or new things, or even known we had to change. And yet for some reason, I just want to delete those 2 years out of my life and get right back to where I was before, and was going to feel bad about it that I didn't.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's so true, right? Like I think that that's where people get, again, the self-compassion piece comes in, right? Which is that, I get that there's a time and a place to, we call it behavior activation or motivational enhancement. Like there's a time where you really do have to kind of push yourself up and do things that you don't want to do. Like for my individuals that are having a hard time with day-to-day tasks of getting out of bed, feeding themselves, like, yeah, you got to kind of push yourself. But I think for the most part, a lot of who we see, they actually need to work on being more compassionate and being okay with not doing all of the things.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm pretty sure in my last 10 years, no one has had the diagnosis of lazy. Right. And yet that's how they view themselves if they're not doing all the things. And, 90% of the time we're talking about some threat of burnout through people's experience of their health with whatever it is. As we kind of wrap up the conversation, Carly, like what do you want sort of the take home message to be for people who are listening today? Like, and what is your sort of vision for, I'm going to say the next 6 months? Uh, let's pull the goalpost in a little sooner, because I think it's nice to think about our mental health in sort of a shorter period of time. But what's your sort of message for our audience, and what do you hope that they sort of capture out of our conversation today?
Um, I think that the biggest take home, I guess, would just be to allow yourself the space to just be human, like, and to think about things in terms of like really doing a mental health check-in for yourself and knowing that you can do that without, paying somebody to do it with you, but just, taking this time to say, okay, like, how am I feeling in the context of burnout? Just literally Google burnout, see what comes up. And my guess is that most people are hitting a lot of those targets, and being able to kind of ask yourself, and what do I need? Like, what is within the realm of possibility for me to do for the next little while? So, what I always ask for people to do is like, there's got to be 3 things that you can say no to. That is your goal. So for the next 3 months, I want you to decide right now, like, what are you going to not do at Christmas time? What do you not need to sign up for this? What meeting do you need to decline? Like, little things, because I truly believe at the crux of a lot of this right now, people just don't have the time, right? Which is in impacting their capacity so much that they then, even when they're coming to therapy, they're sitting across from me on that couch, they're taking in whatever they can from that hour with me, and then they're going home and they don't have the capacity or the energy to be able to put any of that into practice, which is fine. Therapy is not always like that. But what I guess I'm asking, what I would wish for people to do is just to take that time right now to say, okay, like, things are rolling, the ball is rolling down this hill really, really quickly. How do I stop it? And what do I need to not always thinking about it like, what do I need to add into my life? Because that sounds like another expectation. But are there things that maybe I need to let go of that are still taking up um, that piece, right? I always have to just kind of remind individuals too that if you've been on the fence about um, doing something more specifically related to your mental health, like looking at what it would feel like to sit in a room and talk to someone who's a trained professional around some of, there definitely doesn't have to be a diagnosis, but this, everybody needs to be talking to someone, in my opinion. um, just not to wait, right? Unfortunately, in our community, kind of fairly well connected in Burlington, Oakville, Hamilton area, that wait lists are long. And so I would say, if you're, and usually when you start to think about it, you should have done it 6 months ago. So bite the bullet, make a call, and see what it's like to get some of that emotional weight off of you, because it does. What did I say to someone yesterday? It's amazing too how, like, people, I think people picture therapy like people just come in and cry and scream. And there's a lot of people that come to therapy and that's still really hard for them, right? So just this idea that, it's quite a gift to have a safe place to be able to do that and know that you can leave that there, right? So everybody right now has every reason to feel like they need to talk through some of these things. What we're going through is not normal. And it's not like life was like picture perfect before that anyways.
Mm-hmm.
So the super ironic part, like, just before the pandemic hit, so I think it was February 2020, I ran a workshop at Thrive for women who were burning out. And so like 2 weeks later, I was like, oh my God, like, things are so bad before then. And now we've just added a crap ton of other things onto our plate. So it's an important time to kind of check in, right?
Mm-hmm.
Also a hard time for people too, right? Like, and I know you know this, but like people are starting to feel it anyways because the season's changing. And that's normally a big dip in a lot of the people we see anyway, and their mood anyways. It's getting darker, all of that stuff. So
Reach
we have,
out.
yeah. And there's a little bit more variance in terms of things to keep you busy if that's what you need, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. No, I think that's such good advice, right? It's funny when I emailed my therapist after all of our appointments got canceled in the spring of 2020, and I emailed him and I was like, "Did you know that the last 10 years we've been getting ready for this?" Right? Because just the like amount of resiliency that has been required. And I won't say that I navigated it perfectly, but I felt very I had a lot of gratitude for a lot of the groundwork that had been laid prior to the pandemic. Just was disappointed that it was inaccessible during the times when I probably needed it the most. But even if you're feeling like you are okay right now, right, that like there is such thing as preventative mental health support, right? I think we always think about going when we have a broken arm, and there is something to be said for just navigating this sort of North American life and society and pressure and aging and all the things that come with all of that. I would sort of even argue that even if you're not feeling like you need to make the call, that like exploring what you are or are not doing to support your mental health and wellness is still a really valuable part of your healthcare to look at, even if you're getting treated for the arthritis in your knee, I'm still going to ask you about your mood. So that's like, it's a very valuable sort of preventative health thing. Carly, thank you so much. I always love our conversations. We always like have an idea about what we're going to talk about, and then we go off on like 60 tangents, and they're all really as important. And we probably could just talk for an entire day.
Yeah, we could.
Thank you so much for your time this morning.
You're welcome. It was lovely to see you.
I hope you enjoyed that episode of Women's Health Unplugged. My goal is to help you feel more confident about your health. Please remember that what we talked about today in the podcast does not constitute medical advice, nor was a doctor-patient relationship formed. If you have questions about your healthcare or about how today's topic pertains to you, please take it up with your family doctor, your specialist, or someone on your health team.